Welcome to my channel, Hidden Points. Imagine a person who walks through reality as if it's a distant echo. Their mind is somewhere else, drifting into worlds that feel softer, safer, and more alive than anything around them. Imagine how their eyes focus on something invisible, how their breath slows, and their thoughts drift into stories they never speak out loud. This is the psychology of the person who lives in a fantasy world. It's not just daydreaming, and it's not just imagination. For many people, fantasy becomes a psychological shelter, an emotional escape, and a private universe where they feel control, comfort, and peace. Inside this world, they can shape their identity, rewrite their story, and erase the dangers and disappointments of real life. For some individuals, fantasy isn't optional, it's survival. When the real world feels unpredictable, overwhelming, or painful, the mind creates a parallel reality where those feelings become manageable. The brain learns that escape is easier than confrontation, that imagination brings relief while reality brings pressure. This creates a pattern where the person runs to their inner world whenever stress, conflict, or expectation becomes too heavy. The more they escape, the stronger the habit becomes. Slowly, reality becomes background noise, and fantasy becomes the primary space where they exist. Many people who live in a fantasy world carry deep emotional wounds. They may have grown up in environments where they felt unseen, unheard, or misunderstood. Their mind learned that imagination is safer than opening up to others, that stories are safer than experiences, and that dreams are safer than relationships. This emotional self-protection grows silently and becomes a lifelong habit. Inside their fantasies, they become what they cannot be in real life. They say what they cannot say, and they feel what they cannot feel. This world becomes the only place where they feel fully themselves, without judgment and without fear. People who live in fantasy often struggle with identity in the real world. Fantasy allows them to shift roles, personalities, and outcomes freely. When they return to reality, they feel restricted, limited, and trapped inside a version of themselves that doesn't match who they truly want to be. This mismatch creates inner tension, confusion, and emotional distance. They begin to invest more energy into the life in their mind than the life outside it. For some individuals, fantasy becomes a form of dissociation. They disconnect from their surroundings, not because they want to be difficult, but because their mind is protecting them from emotional overload. When the world feels too loud, they retreat into the quiet space inside themselves. When the world feels too demanding, they retreat into the comforting narratives they control. This retreat becomes a default response to stress, and they may not even notice they are doing it because it feels so natural and automatic. The person who lives in fantasy is often highly sensitive and deeply imaginative. They notice details others ignore, and they feel emotions intensely. This intensity can be overwhelming, so their mind softens it by translating reality into story, metaphor, and symbolism. This makes their internal world richer, but it also makes the real world feel dull or disappointing in comparison. The person becomes emotionally dependent on fantasy because real life cannot match the color, meaning, or safety of the world inside their head. This internal dependency makes relationships difficult. They may idealize others, create unrealistic expectations, or struggle to stay present. People may misunderstand them as distant, distracted, or uninterested when, in truth, they are caught between two realities trying to manage both. This emotional split can lead to loneliness because the world in their mind feels familiar and comforting, while the world outside feels unpredictable and emotionally unsafe. One of the deepest psychological reasons someone lives in fantasy is the fear of failure. Inside their imagination, they cannot fail, they cannot be rejected, they cannot be humiliated, and they cannot lose. The fear of making mistakes in real life pushes them into a world where everything works out the way they design it. This brings temporary relief, but over time, it prevents them from taking risks, growing, and experiencing real connection. People who live in fantasy often feel misunderstood because explaining their inner world feels impossible and exposing it feels too vulnerable, so they keep everything inside, smile politely, and say they are okay while their mind drifts into a world that feels more like home. The truth is that fantasy is not the problem. Imagination is one of the most powerful human strengths. The problem appears when fantasy becomes the only emotional refuge and the person never learns to feel safe in reality. Healing starts when the person learns to bring small pieces of their inner world into real life. They can express their creativity through writing, art, or projects. They can explore their imagination in ways that connect them to others, instead of isolating them. Healing also means learning emotional regulation, so reality no longer feels dangerous or overwhelming, and the mind no longer feels forced to escape. Slowly, they can build a life that feels less like something to run away from and more like something to participate in. The goal is not to destroy the fantasy world, because it's a meaningful part of who they are. The goal is to balance it, so the inner world becomes a source of creativity, not a hiding place, and the outer world becomes a place they can exist safely, without fear. This balance allows them to live fully in both worlds, without losing themselves in either. If you recognize yourself in this description, please know that you are not alone, and your imagination is a gift, not a weakness. If you feel overwhelmed, reaching out to a mental health professional can provide you with tools to help bridge the gap between your inner world and the one outside. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. See you next time.